Namaste. Welcome to the Advaita channel. I'll be reading from The Transparency of Things, Contemplating the Nature of Experience by Rupert Spira. Saku Mujijiki J. Saku Anantajiki J. Consciousness is self-luminous. When you see the sun rise, do you not see a round disk of fire, somewhat like a guinea? Oh no, no. I see an innumerable company of the heavenly host crying, "Glory, glory, glory is the Lord God Almighty." And that quote is by William Blake. On which everything is experienced, and at the same time, it is that which experiences everything. The image that appears in the mirror is made only of mirror. When a physical object is placed in front of a mirror, it colours the mirror, and this colouring of the mirror seems to give the mirror object-like qualities. The mirror seems to take on the qualities of whatever is being reflected within it. When the physical object vanishes, the mirror again becomes colourless. In fact, it was always only this. Consciousness is transparent and cannot be seen as an object. In the same way that the glass out of which the mirror is made cannot be seen unless a physical object is reflected in it. When a thought sensation or a perception is present, it colours consciousness in the same way that the reflection in the mirror colours the mirror. The thought, sensation, or perception reveals consciousness in the same way that the reflection reveals the mirror. The object that appears in consciousness is nothing other than consciousness, in the same way that the object that appears in the mirror is nothing other than the mirror. When we see an object, that is, when a thought, sensation, or perception appears in consciousness, consciousness is experiencing itself. In fact, consciousness is always only experiencing itself. The metaphor of the mirror is helpful in that it enables us to understand that consciousness cannot be experienced as an object. However, unlike the mirror, consciousness is conscious. It perceives. It experiences itself all the time, whether or not thoughts, sensations, or perceptions are present. The mirror needs a source outside of itself to be seen, unlike consciousness, which is simultaneously that which sees and the screen on which it is seen. It is by definition always experiencing itself, although if no object is present, that experience has no objective qualities. A more accurate metaphor would be that of a vast, limitless space of which every part is conscious, sensitive, aware. The nature of this space is to be conscious. It cannot turn off this consciousness. Imagine that within this limitless space, several holographic images, each of a house with many rooms, are projected. Each room is like a separate body-mind. What happens to this limitless space when the hologram is projected? Does it change in any way? What happens to the space when some of the images of houses are withdrawn and when new ones appear? Is there anywhere in these images where space is not present? Is the space that is contained within the apparent walls of the houses limited by those walls? Is it not the same space inside, outside, and within the walls themselves? In fact, there is no inside and no outside in this space because the houses are made out of exactly the same substance as the space in which they appear. Even to say that the houses appear in the space is not quite right, because they do not come into the space. They exist. They arise out of the space itself. Their substance is made of that in which they arise. Their substance is made of that in which they arise. That which gives them existence is the substance out of which they arise. The space is their existence. They are made out of the substance of the space. However, their appearance is the name and form of the house. The same is true of our experience. The substance of all appearances is the presence in which they arise. The existence of an object derives its being from the presence in which it arises. Its appearance is derived from its name and form. That which sees is that which is seen. consciousness which perceives the world is one with the reality of the world. Consciousness and reality are one. An experience consists of the creation of an object, the substance of the object, and the knowing of the object. These three are one simultaneously. The space of consciousness is a knowing space. It is self-luminous, self-knowing, ever-present, self-evident. It knows itself in and as this current experience. It is the reality of all things and is its own reality. The choice of freedom. Does the individual have free will? Even conventional science tells us that there are no separate entities in the universe, that everything is interconnected. So the issue of whether or not an apparent separate entity has free will or choice is really not addressed here. Rather, we go straight to the question about the existence of the separate entity, and having explored it thoroughly, we see what happens to the question about free will and choice. Nothing binds consciousness except its own desire to bind itself through belief. Every experience arises spontaneously out of the absolute freedom of consciousness at every moment. And in that sense, consciousness is free to take any form it chooses out of an infinity of possibilities. Every apparent choice is an expression of the absolute freedom of consciousness. Sense of freedom and choice that we feel is an intuition of the innate freedom of consciousness, which at some level we know to be our own. There is something oppressive about teachings that continuously reiterate the fact that we have no choice or freedom. Such a statement is directed at a non-existent personal entity, and ironically, in doing so, condones the very entity it denies. It is true that the separate entity has no freedom. But as there is no separate entity, why mention it? Consciousness, that which we are, is freedom itself. We as consciousness have absolute freedom. We are absolute freedom. The feeling that we have the freedom to make a choice is a pale and usually misinterpreted reflection of this intuitive knowledge of our own innate freedom. As a reflection of real freedom, it is true. Only the interpretation that this freedom is the freedom of an individual entity is false. This exploration of the nature of experience takes place within consciousness and is an expression of consciousness. There is no entity that does the exploring. Even from the point of view of scientific materialism, there are no separate entities in the universe. Everything is interconnected. If all the minds, bodies, and worlds that exist are interconnected in one seamless system, how could the consciousness, which is considered in scientific materialism to be a byproduct of this system, itself be individual and separate? And if there is no separate, independent consciousness, how can there be a separate, independent thinker, chooser, doer, enjoyer, experiencer? Our experience is a stream of appearances in consciousness. These events are thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions, one following another. A, B, C, D, E. Each is utterly unique, and each disappears absolutely before the next arises. Event A is the hearing of rain. Event B is the thinking, let's have some tea. Event C is the tasting of tea. Event D is the feeling of satisfaction. Event E is the perceiving of traffic. Event F is the thought that I didn't cause the rain, but heard it, that I chose to have tea and enjoyed it, that I perceived the traffic but did not create it, and finally that I remained over after all these experiences had vanished. The I in this stream of events is itself simply another appearance, just like all the rest. The I is the thought I. However, when the hearing of rain is present, the I thought is not. Likewise, when the thought, "let's have some tea," is present, the I thought is not. In between these two thoughts lies the timeless presence of consciousness, the blue sky shining between the clouds. The I thought is created to fill this interval, to impersonate the true I of consciousness. This little I thought that then vanishes before the next thought, "let's have some tea," appears and reappears again after it to fill the gap. In this way, innumerable I thoughts are strung together and conceived by a subsequent thought to have existed as the permanent entity that is present between and behind all appearances. In this way, innumerable I thoughts are strung together and conceived by a subsequent thought to have existed as the permanent entity that is present between and behind all appearances. However, it is consciousness, not a separate entity, which is ever present between and behind every perception. The separate entity is created by and with the thought that thinks it, and is nothing other than that thought in that moment. The next moment it vanishes, just like any other thought. It is an imposter. To think that event F, the I thought, did not cause event A, but did cause event B, is inconsistent with our experience and defies logic. This lack of consistency is called the person, the separate entity, the chooser. If we think in terms of cause and effect, we should say that A caused B, which caused C, which caused D, and so on. In other words, everything is linked together in a chain of causality. Everything causes everything. The totality causes the totality at every moment. Or we can say that everything arises spontaneously out of consciousness, and that consciousness is therefore its sole and ultimate cause. Both of these positions can be said to be true of our actual experience. In fact, these two possibilities amount to the same thing, because the totality in the first position turns out, on further investigation, to be identical to consciousness in the second position. So everything causes everything. The totality causes the totality at every moment. Or we can say that everything arises spontaneously out of consciousness, and that consciousness is therefore its sole and ultimate cause. Both of these positions can be said to be true of our actual experience. In fact, these two possibilities amount to the same thing, because the totality in the first position turns out, on further investigation, to be identical to consciousness in the second position. In fact, the idea of causality falls apart completely when it is understood that experience is not a series of events appearing in consciousness, but rather that it is consciousness itself taking the shape of hearing, thinking, tasting, enjoying, perceiving, etc. Our experience is not a series of events. It is one ever-present event, one ever-present non-event, consciousness, being, reality, immovable, unchanging, homogeneous. What is there to cause what, if consciousness is all there is? The ease of being. Consciousness is not inherently identified with the body or the mind. Consciousness is prior to the body, mind, or world. The natural condition of consciousness is freedom, happiness, and peace. When an object appears, it appears as a modulation of consciousness. Consciousness is simultaneously the substance and the witness of whatever appears. However, consciousness is not separate or removed from the object, perceiving it from a distance. When an object is present, that object is one with consciousness. If they separate, the objective aspect vanishes utterly, instantly, whilst consciousness remains as it always is. Language cannot describe this because even in attempting to describe it, there is a reference to two things, the object and consciousness. Two words are used, whereas in fact there are never two things. An object is the shape that consciousness assumes, in the same way that a wave is the shape that water assumes. Consciousness is one with every object. In fact, in the ultimate analysis, there are no objects. There is only consciousness taking the shape of our experience from moment to moment. The identity of an object is the identity of consciousness. An object could not appear if it were not one with consciousness. Consciousness is every appearance, but that does not mean that consciousness is limited to that appearance. The I am the body idea arises in consciousness, just like any other appearance, and as such it is the form that consciousness takes at that moment. However, the fact it arises in consciousness doesn't necessarily make it true, any more than the thought that 2 plus 2 equals 5, which also arises in consciousness, is true. It is an expression of truth, but it is not true. The sensation or cluster of sensations that are referred to as the body seldom appears without some perception of the world also. This conglomerate of sensations and perceptions is one seamless experience. However, consciousness arbitrarily divides this seamless experience of sensations, perceptions into two, into sensation and perception. It does this by identifying itself exclusively with the sensations, with the body, and by disidentifying itself from the perceptions, from the world. It thinks I am this cluster of sensations, the body, but not that group of perceptions, the world. Therefore, it is not so much the I am the body idea, but rather the I am only the body idea that is problematic. In order to remedy this exclusivity, some teachings suggest separating the perceiving consciousness from the appearance of the body, mind, in order to establish that consciousness stands alone and prior to all experience, to all appearances. This in turn paves the way for a more complete understanding, in which it is seen that experience is at every moment one seamless totality. Consciousness is one with the totality of every experience, not just with a fragment, the body-mind. In order to effect this second stage of understanding, consciousness first disengages itself from its exclusive identification with a single body-mind and comes to know itself as nothing, as not a thing, not an object or an appearance. It comes to know itself as the witness of all objects, before re-engaging with the totality of its experience and recognizing itself as everything. Consciousness transitions from I am something to I am nothing, and then from I am nothing to I am everything, without ever being or becoming anything other than itself. However, this second stage is sometimes not emphasized in traditional teachings that tend to focus more on the witnessing aspect of consciousness, the I am not the body aspect, the I am nothing aspect. This sometimes leads to a body negative or experience negative approach. These teachings often make a goal of nirvikalpa samadhi, the experience of consciousness knowing itself without an object, which has in most cases to be maintained through effort in order to keep at bay what is considered to be the dangerous and distracting realm of thinking, feeling, sensing and perceiving. However, it would be a misunderstanding to imply that by establishing consciousness as the independent witness, distinct from the witnessed, a dualistic paradigm of subject and object is being condoned. Without the recognition of the primacy and independence of consciousness, there is nothing to suggest that there is anything more to experience than a continuous flow of appearances, and this understanding could be expressed as there is only this, meaning that there is only this current thought, sensation, or perception. However, once it is established in experience that consciousness exists prior to and independent of all appearances, it can be seen clearly that it is only consciousness itself that takes the shape of the flow of appearances, in which case, in the statement, there is only this, this refers to consciousness, not to objects. This distinction is the difference between solipsism and wisdom, although both can be expressed by the same statement. Thank you for joining me. It's been lovely to share the directness of this experience of the self as nothing but this consciousness. Sadhguru Mujiji Ki Jai. Sadhguru Anantaji Ki Jai.